Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy History Facts channel. Tonight, we are drifting back through time to one of the most extraordinary civilizations the world has ever known. Ancient Egypt, a world of golden deserts and dark river mud, of god-kings and humble farmers, of monuments so vast they still silence the people who stand before them thousands of years later. Egypt was not simply a place. It was an idea that the world could be ordered, that the chaos beyond the horizon could be held back, that death was not an ending, but a passage into something longer and stranger and more deliberate than ordinary life. The more closely you look at ancient Egypt, the more it opens up. Beneath the famous images of pyramids and golden masks lies a civilization of farmers and scribes and priests and workers who built something that lasted longer than almost anything else human hands have ever made. This is a story of power and faith and daily life, and the remarkable lengths a people went to in order to make their world feel permanent. If these gentle journeys through history bring you some peace, I would love it if you liked or subscribed or simply left a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, all you need to do is settle in. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow just a little. And as the evening deepens around you, come with me down to the banks of the Nile and into the long golden world of ancient Egypt. Let us begin. Ancient Egypt was held together, not by force alone, but by an idea called Mut. Mut was the Egyptian concept of truth, balance, and cosmic order. It was not simply a philosophical idea. It was the organizing principle of the entire civilization. Every pharaoh who ever ruled was understood to be the living embodiment of Mut. Their primary duty was not to conquer or to build, though they did both, but to maintain the balance between order and chaos that kept the world functioning. The Nile flooded on schedule. The sun rose and set. The crops grew and were harvested. These were not accidents. They were understood as the result of Mut being maintained by a righteous ruler, performing the correct rituals, and keeping the gods satisfied. When things went wrong, when floods failed or famines struck, or enemies invaded, it was understood as a breakdown of Mut, a sign that the balance had been disturbed. This made the pharaoh's role almost impossibly heavy. He or she was personally responsible for the functioning of the natural world. The idea of Mut touched everything. It shaped how laws were written, how the dead were judged, how officials were expected to behave, and how ordinary people understood their place in the universe. Egypt lasted as long as it did, partly because this idea gave everyone from the highest priest to the humblest farmer a sense that their world had a structure worth maintaining. Mut was not enforced through fear alone. It was genuinely believed. The scribes who copied religious texts were not simply doing their jobs. They were participating in the maintenance of cosmic order. The priests who performed temple rituals were not merely following tradition. They were holding the world together. That belief gave Egyptian civilization a coherence and a stability that allowed it to absorb foreign invasions, internal power struggles, and natural disasters, and continue recognizably itself across an almost unimaginable span of time. The Nile was not simply a river. It was the reason Egypt existed at all. Without the Nile, there would have been no Egypt. The surrounding land was desert, harsh and unforgiving, and almost entirely unable to support a large population. But every year, the Nile flooded its banks and left behind a layer of rich, dark silt that made the narrow strip of land on either side almost impossibly fertile. The Egyptians called this dark soil the Black Land, and they called the desert beyond it the Red Land. The boundary between the two was the boundary between life and death. Everything that made Egyptian civilization possible grew from that thin strip of black soil. Food, flax for linen, papyrus for writing, mud for bricks, clay for pottery. The flood itself was so important that the Egyptians built their entire calendar around it. Their year was divided into 3 seasons: the flood, the growing season, and the harvest. The flood was also understood as a divine gift. The waters that brought life were associated with the god Hapi, a plump and abundant figure who represented the fertility that the inundation provided. To live in Egypt was to live in a rhythm entirely shaped by that annual rising and falling of water. The river was not background scenery. It was the pulse of the entire civilization. Farmers planned their lives around the flood. Administrators measured it at nilometers. Stone structures with graduated markings built at strategic points along the river that allowed officials to predict the quality of the coming harvest based on how high the water rose during the inundation. A flood that was too low meant drought and famine. A flood that was too high could destroy villages and drown livestock. The ideal flood was one that deposited exactly the right depth of fertile silt and then receded in time for planting. When the flood was good, the granaries filled and Egypt prospered. When it failed, the consequences could be devastating. Several periods of Egyptian history show evidence of severe famines connected to failures of the annual inundation. The Nile gave Egypt its life and its rhythm and its prosperity, but it also reminded the Egyptians that beneath the order of Ma'at lay forces they could worship and measure, but never fully control. Pharaohs were not simply kings. They were living gods walking among their people. The word Pharaoh itself came from a term meaning great house, originally referring to the royal palace rather than the ruler himself. But the person who occupied that house was understood to be something far beyond ordinary humanity. The pharaoh was the son of the sun god Ra. He was the earthly form of the falcon god Horus. When he died, he became Osiris, god of the dead, and his successor became the new Horus. This divine identity was not merely symbolic. It shaped every aspect of how the pharaoh was presented to the world. His image was always shown larger than the figures around him. His name was written in a special oval cartouche that set it apart from ordinary text. He wore a double crown representing the unity of Upper and Lower Egypt. He carried a crook and flail that symbolized his role as shepherd and disciplinarian of his people. He was depicted in art as physically perfect, eternally youthful, and always victorious, even when the historical record suggests otherwise. The gap between the divine image and the human reality behind it was enormous. But that gap was precisely the point. The pharaoh had to appear godlike because his divine nature was the foundation on which the entire system of Egyptian power rested. Without a divine king, the cosmic order had no earthly anchor. The temples could not be maintained, the gods could not be appeased, and the Nile might fail to flood. Everything depended on the pharaoh performing his role correctly and being believed to be what he was claimed to be. This gave Egyptian rulership a quality quite different from kingship in other ancient cultures. The pharaoh was not simply the most powerful person in the land. He was the point at which the human and divine worlds met. His coronation was not a political ceremony. It was a cosmic event. His death was not an ordinary death. It was a transformation into another kind of being, and his tomb was not simply a grave. It was a gateway between worlds through which the divine energy of kingship could continue to flow even after the individual who had embodied it had passed beyond. The pyramids were not built by slaves. They were built by a paid and organized workforce. This is one of the most persistent misconceptions about ancient Egypt. The workers who built the Great Pyramids at Giza were not enslaved people driven by fear and suffering. Archaeological evidence from the workers' village discovered near the pyramids tells a very different story. The builders were Egyptian workers, organized into name gangs with titles like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkaure. They were fed well. Cattle, sheep, goats, fish, bread, and beer were provided in large quantities. They received medical care. Skeletons found at the site show evidence of surgical amputation and bone setting, suggesting a level of medical attention that reflects how valued the workers were. They were honored in death. A cemetery for workers was found near the site, with tombs that show these people were given burials, reflecting their importance. The construction was organized with extraordinary efficiency. Ramps, sledges, water poured to reduce friction, and an enormous administrative system coordinated the movement of millions of stone blocks, weighing on average 2.5 tons each. The pyramids were not monuments of cruelty. They were monuments of organized human ambition on a scale that still defies easy comprehension thousands of years later. The workers came in rotating shifts from villages across Egypt. During the flood season, when the fields were underwater and agricultural work was impossible, the workforce could be redirected to the pyramid site without disrupting food production. The flood also made it easier to float heavy stone blocks on barges from the quarries at Aswan and Tura to the building site at Giza. The organization required to feed, house, equip, and coordinate tens of thousands of workers across years and decades was itself a remarkable administrative achievement. Egypt built the pyramids not because it forced its people to, but because it had developed the organizational capacity to mobilize them, and the belief system that made such a project feel worth doing. The Great Pyramid of Khufu was the tallest structure on Earth for nearly 4,000 years. When it was completed around 2,560 years before the Common Era, it rose to a height of approximately 146 meters. That height made it the tallest thing human hands had ever built, and it held that record for nearly 4,000 years until the construction of medieval cathedrals in Europe finally surpassed it. The precision involved is staggering. The base of the pyramid is level to within just 2.1 centimeters across its entire 430-meter length on each side. The four sides are oriented to the cardinal directions with an accuracy that modern surveyors using advanced equipment struggle to improve upon. The pyramid was originally encased in smooth white Tura limestone that would have caught the desert sun and blazed with reflected light, visible for enormous distances. Most of that casing stone was removed in later centuries and used in the construction of buildings in Cairo. But the core structure remains almost entirely intact. Inside, a series of passages and chambers leads to the king's chamber at the heart of the monument, where a granite sarcophagus sits in near total darkness. The Great Pyramid is the oldest of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and the only one still standing. That survival is not accidental. It is a testament to the precision and ambition of the people who built it. The pyramid contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks. If those blocks were cut into slices 30 centimeters thick, they would encircle the entire Earth at the equator. The mortar used between the casing stones was analyzed by modern scientists and found to be of a type that has never been exactly replicated. Its composition is known, but the process by which it was made to such consistent quality across such an enormous project remains incompletely understood. The Great Pyramid is simultaneously one of the best studied structures in human history, and one that continues to yield new surprises to modern investigation. Moon scanning in recent years revealed previously unknown voids within the structure, suggesting that there may still be chambers or passages that no modern person has ever entered. The Sphinx was carved from a single outcrop of natural limestone bedrock. The Great Sphinx of Giza is one of the largest and oldest statues in the world, and yet many of the most basic facts about it remain genuinely uncertain. We do not know with complete certainty which pharaoh it was built for, though most Egyptologists believe it was Khafra, builder of the second pyramid at Giza. We do not know exactly when it was built, though the most widely accepted date places its construction around 4,500 years ago. What we do know is that it was carved directly from a natural knoll of limestone that already existed on the Giza plateau, shaped by the workers into the form of a recumbent lion with a human head, wearing the royal Nemes headdress. It is approximately 73 meters long and 20 meters tall. The face was originally painted, and the entire statue may have been brightly colored. There is evidence that the nose was deliberately removed at some point in the medieval period, though the romantic story that Napoleon's artillery was responsible is almost certainly false. The Sphinx has spent much of its existence buried to the neck in sand. It has been excavated multiple times across the centuries. Each excavation has revealed a monument still surprising in its scale, and still guarding its secrets with extraordinary patience. Between the paws of the Sphinx stands a stele, a carved stone slab, placed there by the pharaoh Thutmose IV around 1400 years before the Common Era. The stele tells the story of how a young prince fell asleep in the shadow of the Sphinx and dreamed that the monument spoke to him, promising him the throne of Egypt if he would clear away the sand that had buried it. The prince became pharaoh and cleared the sand as promised. Whether the story is literally true or was invented to justify an excavation project that the new pharaoh wanted to undertake anyway is impossible to say. But it tells us something important about how the Egyptians themselves related to this monument that was already ancient in their own time. The Sphinx was not simply a statue to them. It was a presence, a being that had been there before living memory, and that continued to inhabit the landscape with an authority that even pharaohs felt compelled to acknowledge and attend to. Egyptian hieroglyphs were not simply decorative. They were a complete and complex writing system. When Europeans first encountered hieroglyphs carved on temple walls and obelisks, they assumed they were purely symbolic, each image representing a concept or idea. The decipherment of the Rosetta Stone in the early 19th century by Jean-François Champollion revealed something far more sophisticated. Hieroglyphs combine three different types of signs: logograms that represented whole words or concepts, phonograms that represented sounds, and determinatives that were silent signs added at the end of words to clarify their category or meaning. The system could be read left to right, right to left, or top to bottom, Depending on which direction the human and animal figures were facing, you always read toward the faces. There were over 700 hieroglyphic signs in common use during the classical period, and the system was in continuous use for over 3,000 years. But hieroglyphs were not the only script the Egyptians used. A simplified cursive form called hieratic was used by scribes for everyday documents. A later, even more simplified script called demotic replaced it for most practical purposes. The last known hieroglyphic inscription was carved in 394 of the Common Era. After that, the knowledge of how to read them was lost for nearly 1,500 years, until the Rosetta Stone gave scholars the key. The Rosetta Stone itself was discovered by French soldiers in 1799 during Napoleon's Egyptian campaign. It is a granodiorite stele, inscribed with the same decree in 3 scripts: hieroglyphic, demotic, and ancient Greek. Because Greek was known to scholars, it provided the key to unlocking the other 2. Champollion, a French linguist who had been obsessed with Egypt since childhood, spent years working on the problem and finally cracked the hieroglyphic code in 1822. When he realized he had succeeded, he reportedly ran to his brother's office, announced that he had done it, and immediately fainted from the excitement. The Rosetta Stone is now in the British Museum in London, where it is the most visited object in the collection. Egypt has repeatedly requested its return. The stone that gave the world back the voices of the ancient Egyptians remains for now in a city those ancient Egyptians never knew existed. Scribes were among the most respected members of Egyptian society. In a civilization where the vast majority of people could not read or write, the ability to record and interpret text made a scribe indispensable. Scribes served the pharaoh, the temples, the military, and the administrative system that kept Egypt's complex economy functioning. They recorded tax assessments, grain inventories, legal proceedings, religious texts, medical knowledge, and royal decrees. Without scribes, the enormous machinery of Egyptian civilization would have ground to a halt. A boy who entered scribal training, and it was almost always boys, began his education around the age of 5 and spent years copying texts, learning the hundreds of signs required, and absorbing the religious and literary traditions that form the backbone of Egyptian culture. The training was demanding, and discipline could be physical. One famous Egyptian text says that the ears of a student are on his back, and he listens best when he is beaten. But the rewards of success were considerable. A trained scribe could rise through the administrative hierarchy to positions of real power and influence. Some of the most important officials in Egyptian history began as scribes. The image of a scribe seated cross-legged with a papyrus roll across his lap and a brush in his hand became one of the defining images of Egyptian civilization. It was a portrait of the power that came from knowing how to read the world. Scribes did not just copy texts mechanically. They were trained in mathematics, accounting, geography, religious knowledge, and the conventions of administrative language. A senior scribe managing the accounts of a large temple might be responsible for hundreds of workers, vast grain stores, extensive land holdings, and complex ritual schedules. The vizier, the most powerful official in Egypt after the pharaoh, was always a man who had come up through the scribal and administrative system. To be able to read and write in ancient Egypt was not simply an educational achievement. It was a door into a world of power and influence that was closed to the majority of the population. The scribes knew this, and they wrote about it with considerable pride. A text known as the Satire of the Trades describes every other profession as exhausting, dirty, underpaid, and miserable, before concluding that the scribal life alone offers dignity, comfort, and respect. Whether or not that assessment was entirely fair, the scribes were the people writing the texts, and they made sure their own profession came out well. The Book of the Dead was not a single book, but a collection of spells for navigating the afterlife. Ancient Egyptians believed that death was not an ending, but a transition into another form of existence that required careful preparation and the right knowledge. The Book of the Dead was a collection of magical texts and spells that the deceased could use to navigate the dangers of the underworld and achieve a successful passage into eternal life. It was not a standardized text. Each copy was custom-made for its owner, containing the specific spells they had paid to have included. Wealthier Egyptians could afford more spells and more elaborate illustrations. The papyrus scroll might be placed inside the coffin or within the wrappings of the mummy. One of the most important sections described the weighing of the heart ceremony. After death, the deceased's heart was weighed on a set of scales against the feather of mud. If the heart was lighter than the feather, the person had lived a good life and could proceed to the paradise of the field of reeds. If the heart was heavier, weighted down by wrongdoing and dishonesty, it was devoured by Amit, a terrifying creature that was part lion, part hippopotamus, and part crocodile. That consumption meant the end of existence entirely. Not punishment, but obliteration. The Egyptians feared not hell, but nothingness. The Book of the Dead was their insurance against that most final of outcomes. The spells in the Book of the Dead covered an enormous range of situations. There were spells to prevent the deceased from having to walk upside down in the underworld, spells to ensure they would not have to eat their own excrement, spells to allow them to transform into various animals if they needed to escape danger, spells to ensure their heart would not testify against them during the weighing ceremony. The attention to practical detail is extraordinary. The ancient Egyptians approached the afterlife the way a careful traveler approaches a journey to a foreign country with an unfamiliar legal system. You needed the right documents, the right knowledge, and the right connections. The Book of the Dead provided all three. It told you what to say at each gate of the underworld, which guardian to address by name, and which spell to recite to ensure your safe passage through each stage of the journey. It was a guidebook to the most important trip you would ever take, and no sensible Egyptian who could afford one wanted to make that journey without it. Mummification was a precise and lengthy process that could take up to 70 days. The purpose of mummification was to preserve the physical body so that the soul could return to it and continue to exist in the afterlife. Without a preserved body, the soul had no home to return to, and the chance of eternal life was lost. The process began with the removal of the organs. The brain was extracted through the nose using a long hooked instrument. The Egyptians did not consider the brain to be important. Thought and emotion were believed to reside in the heart, which was left in place inside the body. The other major organs, the lungs, liver, stomach, and intestines, were removed and preserved separately in 4 containers called canopic jars. Each jar was protected by one of the 4 sons of Horus. The body cavity was then packed and covered with natron, a naturally occurring salt, and left to dry for approximately 40 days. After drying, the body was cleaned, oiled, wrapped in hundreds of meters of linen bandages, and adorned with amulets placed at specific locations to protect different parts of the body. A mask was placed over the face. The wealthy had masks of gold. Others had masks of painted cartonnage or wood. The entire process took approximately 70 days from death to burial. The care and precision involved reflected how seriously the Egyptians took the journey that lay beyond the visible world. Different amulets were placed at different points in the wrapping to protect specific parts of the body or to confer specific powers on the deceased. The heart scarab, placed over the heart, was inscribed with a spell instructing the heart not to speak against its owner during the weighing ceremony. The Djed pillar amulet was associated with Osiris and symbolized stability and endurance. The Waz scepter represented power. The Ankh represented life. Each amulet had a specific meaning and a specific position in the wrapping, and the priests who performed the mummification knew exactly where each one belonged. The finished mummy was placed in a series of nested coffins, each more elaborate than the last, depending on the wealth of the deceased, and then placed in the tomb with everything the person might need in the life that the Egyptians were absolutely certain lay ahead. Canopic jars protected the organs of the dead, and each was guarded by a specific deity. The 4 canopic jars that held the preserved organs of a mummified person were not simply containers. They were sacred objects that carried religious significance and divine protection. Each jar was associated with one of the 4 sons of Horus and with one of the 4 cardinal directions. The jar with a human head, Imseti, protected the liver and was associated with the south. The jar with a baboon head, Hapi, protected the lungs and was associated with the north. The jar with a jackal head, Duamutef, protected the stomach and was associated with the east. The jar with a falcon head, Kebesnuef, protected the intestines and was associated with the west. Each jar was also under the protection of a specific goddess. The goddesses Isis, Nephthys, Neith, and Serket stood guard over the 4 jars, with their arms outstretched in a gesture of eternal protection. In earlier periods, the lids of canopic jars were plain. Over time, they developed into the distinctive heads that have become so recognizable. The precision of this system reflects how carefully the Egyptians organized every aspect of death and preparation for what they believed came after it. The canopic jars were placed in a chest near the mummy in the tomb and were considered as important as the mummy itself. To damage or destroy a canopic jar was to threaten the eternal existence of the person whose organs it contained. The organs needed to be available to the deceased in the afterlife, just as the body did, because the eternal self of the Egyptian was not a purely spiritual concept. It was physical and required physical completeness to function. This is why the preservation of every part of the body, including organs that modern medicine has taught us to think of as merely biological, was treated with such extraordinary care and attention. To the ancient Egyptians, there was nothing merely biological about the liver or the lungs. They were sacred components of a sacred being that deserved the protection of gods and the craftsmanship of the finest artisans. The Valley of the Kings contains the tombs of pharaohs hidden beneath the desert rock. On the west bank of the Nile, near the ancient city of Thebes, which is modern-day Luxor, a hidden valley was chosen as the burial place of Egypt's New Kingdom pharaohs for a period of nearly 500 years. The pyramids of the Old Kingdom had proved too visible and too vulnerable to tomb robbers. The solution was to cut tombs deep into the limestone rock of a remote valley and conceal their entrances as effectively as possible. Workers from a village called Deir el-Medina spent their lives cutting and decorating these underground palaces for the kings they served. The tombs were filled with everything the pharaoh might need in the afterlife: food, furniture, clothing, jewelry, weapons, chariots, games, and thousands of shabtis, small figurines that would magically come to life to perform labor on behalf of the deceased if called upon in the afterlife. Despite the secrecy, almost every tomb in the Valley of the Kings was robbed in antiquity, most of them within a few centuries of the burial. The one spectacular exception was the tomb of Tutankhamun, discovered largely intact by Howard Carter in 1922. The treasures found in that relatively modest royal tomb gave the modern world its most vivid glimpse into the astonishing wealth and artistic sophistication of ancient Egyptian royal burial. The workers who built and decorated the royal tombs lived in a purpose-built village just over the ridge from the Valley of the Kings. Deir el-Medina is one of the best preserved ancient settlements in the world, and the documents found there give us an extraordinarily detailed picture of daily life among skilled workers in ancient Egypt. We know what they were paid, and when the payments were late. We know about their disputes with neighbors over property and inheritance. We know about their marriages, their divorces, their illnesses, and their debts. We know that they went on strike when their rations did not arrive, sitting down outside the royal mortuary temples and refusing to work until the vizier came and sorted out the problem. These were not anonymous laborers. They were skilled professionals with names and families and opinions and grievances, and they left enough records behind them for modern historians to know them almost as individuals. The people who built the most secret tombs in ancient Egypt left behind some of the most revealing documents about Egyptian life that have ever been found. Tutankhamun became famous in death in a way he never achieved in life. During his own lifetime, Tutankhamun was a relatively minor pharaoh. He came to the throne as a child of around 9 or 10 years old and died when he was approximately 19, leaving no surviving children. His reign lasted only about 10 years and was largely devoted to reversing the religious reforms of his predecessor, Akhenaten, who had attempted to replace Egypt's traditional pantheon of gods with worship of a single solar deity called the Aten. Tutankhamun restored the old gods, reopened the temples, and moved the capital back to Thebes, essentially undoing the revolution his predecessor had begun. After his death, he was buried in a relatively small tomb in the Valley of the Kings, and within a few generations, his name had been erased from official records, and his memory largely suppressed by later rulers who wanted to distance themselves from the Akhenaten period entirely. That erasure is precisely why his tomb survived intact. Later, tomb robbers working from official records had no reason to seek it out. When Howard Carter finally broke through into the burial chamber in 1922 and held a candle to the opening, he was asked what he could see. His answer has become one of the most famous sentences in the history of archaeology. Wonderful things. The tomb contained over 5,000 individual objects packed into 4 small rooms, with an attention to detail that suggested the burial had been organized in some haste, possibly because the young king's death was unexpected. Among the treasures was a solid gold innermost coffin weighing over 100 kilograms, a golden death mask of incomparable beauty, alabaster vessels, painted wooden chests, a golden throne, model boats, chariots dismantled and stacked against the wall. linen clothing folded after 3,000 years, still showing the creases, and food offerings, including honey, that was still technically edible after more than 3,000 years in the sealed tomb. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb was the greatest archaeological find of the 20th century, and the golden mask that emerged from it became the face of ancient Egypt for the entire modern world. The god Osiris ruled the underworld, and his story shaped how Egyptians understood death and rebirth. The myth of Osiris was one of the most powerful and enduring stories in all of Egyptian religion. Osiris was the god of the dead, of resurrection, and of the fertile Nile flood. According to the myth, he was a good and wise king who was murdered by his jealous brother Set, who cut his body into 14 pieces and scattered them across Egypt. His devoted wife Isis searched the entire land and gathered the pieces back together. With the help of the god Anubis, she reassembled and mummified the body, performing the first act of mummification in Egyptian mythology. Osiris was then resurrected, not to live again in the mortal world, but to rule as king of the dead in the underworld. His son Horus, conceived by Isis after the resurrection, grew up to avenge his father and defeat Set in a great cosmic battle, becoming the rightful king of the living world. This myth gave the Egyptians a framework for understanding death, not as defeat, but as transformation. Every dead person was identified with Osiris. Every pharaoh in life was Horus. Every pharaoh in death became Osiris. The cycle of death and resurrection, played out in the myth, was mirrored in the cycle of the Nile. The flooding and receding, the death of vegetation and its return. Egypt saw its own story reflected in the movements of water and grain and the turning of the year. The conflict between Horus and Set was one of the great cosmic dramas of Egyptian religion. Set was not simply evil in the way a modern story might portray a villain. He was chaos, the desert, the storm, the necessary darkness that defined the light by contrast. He had his own temples and his own worshippers. Some pharaohs even took his name as part of their own, most notably Seti I. The relationship between Horus and Set was not the simple triumph of good over evil, but the ongoing negotiation between order and chaos that the Egyptians understood as the fundamental dynamic of the universe. Their myths were not fairy tales. They were maps of reality, describing forces that operated in the natural world and in human society, and in the hidden processes of the cosmos beyond what the eye could see. Temples were not places of public worship, but houses of the gods maintained by priests. The great temples of ancient Egypt were not designed as places where ordinary people came to pray in the way that a church or mosque might be. They were understood as the literal homes of the gods who dwelt within them. The innermost sanctuary of each temple contained a statue of the deity, which was believed to be inhabited by the divine presence of that god. Every day, a team of priests performed rituals to care for the god, as though caring for a living being of the highest possible importance. The statue was woken, washed, anointed with oils, dressed in fresh linen, offered food and drink, and put to rest again in the evening. Ordinary Egyptians could enter the outer courtyards of temples on festival days, but the inner sanctuaries were restricted to priests and the pharaoh. The purpose of these daily rituals was not personal devotion in the modern sense. It was cosmic maintenance. If the god was kept happy and properly cared for, the god would continue to perform their divine function, and the world would continue to operate as it should. Neglecting the temple rituals was not simply impious, It was cosmically dangerous. It risked the withdrawal of divine support from the fragile project of maintaining Ma'at and keeping chaos at bay. Temples were also enormous economic institutions. A major temple like Karnak owned vast estates of agricultural land, herds of livestock, fleets of boats, workshops producing linen and pottery, and a workforce that numbered in the thousands. The priests who served the temple were organized in a rotating schedule that divided them into groups called philes, who served for 1 month out of every 4, returning to their homes and ordinary lives between periods of service. This meant that the priestly class was not a separate caste living entirely apart from society, but an integral part of the wider community. Men who divided their time between sacred duties and ordinary Egyptian life. The wealth that flowed through the major temples was so enormous that by the later New Kingdom period, the high priests of Amun at Karnak had accumulated enough power and resources to rival the pharaoh himself. The relationship between royal authority and temple power was one of the defining tensions in the political life of Egypt across much of its history. Karnak was not a single temple, but an entire sacred city that grew for over 2,000 years. The temple complex at Karnak near modern Luxor is the largest religious structure ever built. It covers an area of approximately 100 hectares and contains a vast collection of temples, chapels, pylons, obelisks, statues, sacred lakes, and processional avenues that accumulated over a period of more than 2,000 years. As successive pharaohs added their own contributions to the complex, the heart of Karnak is the great temple of Amun, the king of the gods during much of the New Kingdom period. Its hypostyle hall alone contains 134 massive columns arranged in 16 rows, the tallest of which reach 23 meters in height. Walking between those columns, even today in ruin, produces a feeling of being inside a stone forest of almost incomprehensible scale. The columns were once brightly painted, and the entire hall was roofed, making it a vast enclosed space of colored stone and filtered light. Different pharaohs built different sections and added their own inscriptions and images, sometimes literally, chiseling out the names of their predecessors and replacing them with their own. Karnak is not simply a monument. It is a record of 2,000 years of ambition, rivalry, devotion, and the relentless human desire to leave something permanent behind. The sacred lake at Karnak was used for ritual purification and for ceremonies involving the sacred bark, a model boat in which the statue of Amun was transported during festivals. Scarab beetles, sacred to the sun god Khepri, were kept on the lake, and a large granite scarab statue stands at its edge today. Local tradition holds that walking 7 times around this scarab brings good luck, and tourists can be seen doing exactly that every day. The processional avenue that connected Karnak to the Temple of Luxor, 3 kilometers to the south, was lined with hundreds of ram-headed sphinxes and was used during the Great Opet Festival, when the statue of Amun was carried in procession from Karnak to Luxor and back. This festival lasted for several weeks and was one of the most important religious and social events in the Egyptian calendar. The Avenue of Sphinxes was recently restored and reopened, and the processional route can now be walked again for the first time in centuries. Akhenaten attempted the most radical religious revolution in Egyptian history. In the 14th century, before the Common Era, a pharaoh came to the throne who would attempt something no Egyptian ruler had ever tried. Amenhotep IV, who renamed himself Akhenaten, declared that there was only one god worthy of worship. Not Amun, not Ra, not Osiris, not any of the hundreds of deities that populated the Egyptian religious world, but the Aten, the physical disk of the sun itself. He closed the temples of the other gods, suppressed their priesthoods, redirected their enormous wealth, abandoned the traditional capital of Thebes, and built an entirely new city in the desert, called Akhetaten, meaning horizon of the Aten, known today as Amarna. The art of his reign broke entirely with thousands of years of Egyptian artistic tradition. Instead of the formal, idealized, eternally youthful depictions of previous pharaohs, Akhenaten was shown with elongated features, a protruding belly, wide hips, and a long, thin face, unlike anything in the previous tradition. His queen Nefertiti appeared with him in images of almost unprecedented intimacy, shown as a near equal, participating in rituals alongside her husband. After Akhenaten's death, his revolution was dismantled. His city was abandoned. His images were defaced. His name was erased. The traditional gods were restored. The attempt to remake Egyptian religion from the ground up had lasted barely 17 years and left behind more questions than answers. Why did Akhenaten do it? The honest answer is that we do not fully know. Some scholars have argued that his monotheistic revolution was motivated primarily by a desire to break the power of the Amun priesthood, whose wealth and influence had grown to rival that of the pharaoh himself. By abolishing Amun and all the other gods, Akhenaten would have swept away the entire priestly establishment at a stroke and concentrated all religious authority in himself and in the Aten he served. Others believe the revolution was genuinely spiritual, that Akhenaten was a true religious visionary who experienced his god directly and reshaped his kingdom around that experience. What is clear is that the revolution did not survive him. The momentum of 3,000 years of tradition proved stronger than 17 years of radical change, and Egypt returned to its gods as though Akhenaten had never existed. Almost, because the questions his reign raises about monotheism, about the nature of divine revelation, about the relationship between religion and power, have fascinated historians and theologians and ordinary curious people. For as long as his strange elongated face has been staring out at us from the fragments of Amarna, Nefertiti was one of the most powerful women in Egyptian history, and her tomb has never been found. The painted limestone bust of Nefertiti, discovered in the workshop of the sculptor Thutmose at Amarna in 1912, is one of the most recognized images from the ancient world. The woman it depicts was far more than a beautiful face. During the reign of Akhenaten, Nefertiti appears in inscriptions and artwork in roles that suggest real political and religious power. She is shown in images traditionally reserved for pharaohs, including smiting enemies and performing religious ceremonies. Some scholars believe she may have ruled Egypt in her own right, either alongside Akhenaten in his final years, or as pharaoh herself after his death, possibly under the name Neferuaten. What happened to her toward the end of Akhenaten's reign is unclear. She disappears from the official record around his 12th regnal year, and the reason for that disappearance has never been definitively established. Her tomb has never been conclusively identified. Some Egyptologists believe she may be the unidentified mummy, known as the Younger Lady, found in the tomb of Amenhotep II. Others believe her burial remains undiscovered, somewhere in the Amarna region. The most famous face of ancient Egypt keeps its deepest secret still. The bust of Nefertiti is now in the Neues Museum in Berlin, where it has been since it was brought to Germany in 1913. Egypt has repeatedly requested its return, arguing that it was taken illegally under an arrangement that misrepresented the object's value and significance. Germany has so far declined to return it. The bust sits in its glass case in Berlin, looking out at the millions of people who come to see it each year with the same composed and slightly distant expression it has worn for 3,300 years. Whatever she was thinking when the sculptor captured her likeness, she has kept that thought entirely to herself. Hatshepsut was one of Egypt's most successful pharaohs, and her successor tried to erase her from history. Hatshepsut ruled Egypt as pharaoh for approximately 22 years during the 15th century before the Common Era, making her one of the longest reigning female pharaohs in Egyptian history. She was the daughter of Thutmose I and the wife of Thutmose II. After her husband's death, she initially ruled as regent for her young stepson Thutmose III, but relatively quickly assumed the full titles and regalia of pharaoh herself. She was depicted in official art wearing the traditional male pharaoh's kilt, false beard, and double crown, while some inscriptions refer to her in the feminine and others in the masculine, reflecting the novelty of her position. Her reign was remarkable for its prosperity and its ambitious building program. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri is one of the architectural masterpieces of the ancient world. She sent a famous trading expedition to the land of Punt that returned with myrrh trees, ebony, ivory, gold, and exotic animals. After her death, her stepson Thutmose III, who had waited decades to rule alone, ordered her images defaced, her statues smashed, and her name chiseled from monuments. It was one of the most thorough attempts at historical erasure in Egyptian history. It almost worked. Her identity was only fully established by modern archaeology, centuries after the civilization that tried to forget her had itself been forgotten. The mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri that Hatshepsut built is carved into the face of a natural cliff and consists of 3 colonnaded terraces rising one above the other in a design of extraordinary elegance and restraint. It was originally filled with gardens of exotic plants brought back from Punt, including the myrrh trees that were transplanted in pots and installed in the lower terrace. Painted reliefs on the walls recorded the events of her reign, including the Punt expedition, in such detail that botanists have been able to identify the species of trees being brought back from the images alone. Many of her statues were smashed and thrown into a pit near the temple, where they were discovered by archaeologists in the 20th century. Painstakingly reassembled from thousands of fragments, they now fill a room in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. A woman who was meant to be forgotten, staring out from every direction at once. The construction of Abu Simbel took 20 years and was built to align perfectly with the sun twice a year. In the 13th century, before the Common Era, Rameses II ordered the construction of 2 enormous temples, cut directly into the sandstone cliffs of southern Egypt near the border with Nubia. The larger temple was fronted by 4 colossal, seated statues of Rameses himself, each approximately 20 meters tall, carved from the living rock of the cliff face. Inside, a long corridor led deep into the mountain to an inner sanctuary containing 4 seated statues of gods, including Ramesses himself, deified alongside them. The temple was oriented with such precision that twice a year, on the 22nd of February and the 22nd of October, the The rising sun shone directly down the entire length of the corridor and illuminated the statues in the inner sanctuary. Only one of the 4 statues, the god of the underworld Ptah, remained in darkness, even on those days. This alignment was not accidental. It required extraordinary astronomical knowledge and planning built into the design from the very beginning. In the 1960s, when the construction of the Aswan High Dam threatened to submerge Abu Simbel beneath the waters of Lake Nasser, an international effort dismantled both temples block by block and moved them to higher ground, preserving one of the most extraordinary architectural achievements of the ancient world. The relocation of Abu Simbel between 1964 and 1968 is one of the great engineering achievements of the 20th century. Over 50 countries contributed to the funding of the project, which was coordinated by UNESCO. The temples were cut into more than 1,000 blocks, weighing up to 30 tons each, moved to a specially prepared site 65 meters higher than the original and 200 meters further back from the river, and reassembled with such precision that the solar alignment was preserved almost exactly. The dates are now off by 1 day compared with the original due to the slight change in position. But the sun still illuminates the inner sanctuary twice a year, as Ramesses intended it to do more than 3,000 years ago. The fact that a modern civilization moved an ancient temple to preserve a solar alignment it had no practical need to preserve says something interesting about what we value and about the hold that ancient Egypt still has on the human imagination. Ramesses II ruled for 66 years and fathered over 100 children. Ramesses II, known as Ramesses the Great, was one of the most prolific builders and most celebrated rulers in all of Egyptian history. His reign of approximately 66 years, from around 1279 to 1213 before the Common Era, was one of the longest in Egyptian history, and he used every year of it to stamp his name on the landscape of Egypt. He built or expanded temples at Karnak, Luxor, Abydos, and across Nubia. He erected more obelisks, statues, and monuments than any other pharaoh. He also had a habit of carving his own name over the monuments of his predecessors, a practice his successors later turned around and applied to his own buildings. His most famous military engagement was the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittite Empire, fought around 1274 before the Common Era. The battle ended in a draw, but Ramesses presented it in inscriptions across Egypt as a great personal victory, including a scene of himself single-handedly routing the enemy. The peace treaty that followed the battle is one of the oldest known international peace treaties, and a copy of it hangs today in the United Nations headquarters in New York. Ramesses lived to approximately 90 years of age, remarkable for any era. His mummy, now in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, shows a man with red hair, a strong jaw, and severe arthritis in his later years. He outlived most of his children and many of his grandchildren. The sheer scale of his building activity meant that his image appeared on monuments from the Nile Delta in the north to deep into Nubia in the south. He had at least 8 official wives and an unknown number of secondary wives and concubines. His family was so large that the Valley of the Queens near the Valley of the Kings contains a tomb built for his sons, the largest tomb ever cut in the Valley of the Kings, with over 120 chambers. When Ramesses finally died, after 66 years on the throne, almost no one in Egypt could remember a time when he had not been pharaoh. He was already a legend in his own lifetime, and he has remained one for more than 3,000 years since. Egyptian women had more legal rights than women in most other ancient civilizations. One of the most striking aspects of ancient Egyptian society, when compared with other civilizations of the ancient world, was the relatively high legal status of women. Egyptian women could own property in their own name. They could inherit from their parents independently of any husband. They could buy and sell goods, enter into contracts, and bring legal cases to court. They could divorce their husbands and were entitled to a share of the marital property. They could serve as witnesses in legal proceedings. They could manage their own affairs without requiring a male guardian to act on their behalf. This did not mean that Egyptian society was equal by modern standards. Men dominated most positions of official power and most professional roles, but the legal protections available to Egyptian women were considerably more substantial than those available to women in ancient Greece or Rome, or in many later civilizations that came after Egypt. Marriage in Egypt was largely a practical and economic arrangement. There was no formal marriage ceremony in the religious sense. A couple simply began living together and were considered married. Divorce was possible for both parties. The relative independence of Egyptian women was noted with some surprise by ancient Greek writers who visited Egypt and found a society that did not always match their own assumptions about how the relationship between men and women should be organized. Documents from Deir el-Medina give us vivid examples of Egyptian women exercising these rights in practice rather than simply in theory. Women appear in legal disputes as plaintiffs and defendants. Women own houses and fields and hire out workers. Women lend grain at interest and demand repayment in court. One document records a woman taking her husband to court for failing to provide her with the oil and clothing she was entitled to under their marriage agreement, and winning the case. These are not exceptional stories. They are ordinary transactions recorded in the administrative documents of an ordinary community, and they show a society in which women's legal personhood was simply an unremarkable fact of daily life. Egyptian medicine was surprisingly advanced and influenced later Greek medical practice. The ancient Egyptians were not simply relying on magic and prayer when they treated illness. They developed a sophisticated medical tradition that combined religious ritual with genuine empirical observation and practical treatment. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, dating to around 1600 years before the Common Era, but likely based on earlier sources, is one of the oldest known medical texts in the world. It describes 48 cases of injury and illness in systematic terms, including examination, diagnosis, and treatment. It approaches medicine in a clinical and rational way that would not seem entirely out of place to a modern reader familiar with medical case notes. Egyptian physicians understood that the heart was connected to the rest of the body through a system of channels, and that the pulse reflected its activity. They had remedies for infections, wounds, digestive problems, and eye diseases. They used willow bark, which contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. They used honey as an antibacterial wound dressing, a practice modern medicine has rediscovered. They set broken bones and performed dental work. The Greeks, who admired Egyptian learning enormously, studied with Egyptian physicians, and the Egyptian medical tradition fed directly into the development of Greek medicine, and through it into the medical traditions of the Western world. The Ebers Papyrus, another medical text dating to around 1550 years before the Common Era, contains over 700 remedies and medical prescriptions covering conditions ranging from crocodile bite to heart disease. Some of the remedies would be recognized as effective today. Others belonged firmly to the magical dimension of Egyptian medicine, involving spells and incantations alongside the physical treatments. The Egyptians did not separate magical healing from physical healing, because they did not recognize the distinction we draw between them. For an ancient Egyptian, a remedy that worked through divine power was no different in principle from one that worked through plant chemistry. The goal was the same in both cases, and the practitioner used whatever worked. This pragmatic attitude toward healing, this willingness to combine observation with tradition and ritual with practical knowledge, made Egyptian medicine one of the most sophisticated healing traditions of the ancient world. Egyptian cats were sacred, and killing one was a crime punishable by death. Cats occupied a special place in ancient Egyptian life and religion. They were associated with the goddess Bastet, who was depicted as a cat, or as a woman with the head of a cat, and who represented protection, fertility, and the warmth of the home. Bastet's main cult center was at Bubastis in the Nile Delta, where her temple attracted enormous festivals that ancient Greek writers described as among the most joyful and well-attended in all of Egypt. Cats were kept in Egyptian homes as both pets and practical hunters who protected grain stores from rats and mice. They were so valued that when a household cat died, the family members shaved their eyebrows as a sign of mourning. Killing a cat, even accidentally, was treated as a serious crime. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus described witnessing a Roman citizen who accidentally killed a cat being killed by a mob, despite the efforts of Egyptian authorities to protect him. Such was the public feeling about the offense. Millions of cats were mummified as religious offerings to Bastet. Archaeological excavations at Bubastis and other sites have uncovered cat cemeteries containing hundreds of thousands of mummified animals. The relationship between ancient Egyptians and cats was one of the longest and most affectionate human-animal partnerships in recorded history. Dogs were also kept as pets and working animals. Their mummies have been found in significant numbers, and some were buried with considerable care. Baboons were sacred to the god Thoth and were kept at temples. Ibises, the long-beaked wading birds, also associated with Thoth, were mummified in such numbers that some ancient Egyptian sites contain ibis mummies, literally by the million. The crocodile was associated with the god Sobek and was worshipped at Kom in Upper Egypt, where live crocodiles were kept in a sacred pool and treated as divine. Mummified crocodiles have been found at multiple sites, along with crocodile eggs and young crocodiles preserved alongside their adults. The ancient Egyptians paid serious ritual attention to an astonishing range of animals, and their landscapes were shaped by this attentiveness in ways that modern archaeology is only beginning to fully appreciate. Obelisks were solar symbols, and many were covered in electrum to catch the light of the sun. The tall, tapering, four-sided stone monuments that the Egyptians called tekenu and that the Greeks named obelisks were among the most potent solar symbols in the Egyptian religious landscape. They were typically erected in pairs at the entrances to temples, and their pointed tips, called pyramidions, were often covered in electrum, a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver that blazed in the sunlight and could be seen from enormous distances. The obelisk was understood as a petrified ray of sunlight, a column of solar energy frozen in the stone that connected the earthly temple to the divine energy of the sun above. Cutting an obelisk from a single piece of granite was an extraordinary engineering feat. The largest known obelisk still in Egypt, the unfinished obelisk at Aswan, was abandoned in the quarry after a crack appeared during cutting. It would have stood approximately 42 meters tall and weighed over 1,000 tons. Many Egyptian obelisks were removed by later empires that admired them, Rome alone eventually accumulated 13 of them. Today, Egyptian obelisks stand in Rome, Paris, London, New York, Istanbul, and other cities around the world. Solar symbols from a 3,000-year-old religion, still catching the light of the same sun they were made to honor. The process of quarrying and transporting an obelisk was itself a feat of organization that reflected the enormous resources available to the Egyptian state. Granite was quarried at Aswan in the far south of Egypt and had to be transported by river to building sites hundreds of kilometers to the north. Reliefs at the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut showed 2 obelisks being transported by barge, the enormous stone shafts laid end to end on a vessel of extraordinary size, being towed by a fleet of rowing boats. How the obelisks were actually erected once they arrived at their destination remains a subject of debate among engineers and archaeologists. Modern experiments using ancient methods have demonstrated that it was possible, but the exact techniques the ancient Egyptians used have not been definitively established. The ancient Egyptians invented a form of paper from papyrus plants that grew along the Nile. Papyrus was one of ancient Egypt's most important exports and most versatile materials. The papyrus plant grew abundantly in the marshes of the Nile Delta, and the Egyptians developed a method of turning its pith into a writing surface that was lighter, more flexible, and easier to produce than the clay tablets used in Mesopotamia or the animal skins used elsewhere. To make papyrus, the green outer rind of the stem was removed, and the inner pith was cut into thin strips. These strips were laid side by side in one direction. Then a second layer was laid crosswise on top. The 2 layers were pressed together, beaten, and left to dry. The natural sugars in the plant acted as a glue, binding the layers together into a smooth writing surface that could be rolled into scrolls. Individual sheets could be joined end to end to create scrolls of considerable length. The Great Harris Papyrus, now in the British Museum, is over 40 meters long. Papyrus was used for religious texts, administrative documents, literary works, medical records, legal proceedings, and personal letters. It was exported across the ancient Mediterranean world and was so associated with writing and record keeping that the word paper, which appears in almost identical form across dozens of modern languages, derives ultimately from the word papyrus. The durability of papyrus in the dry Egyptian climate has been extraordinary. Documents written more than 3,000 years ago survive in legible condition because the desert preserved them in a way that the damp climates of most other regions would not have allowed. Personal letters, shopping lists, legal complaints, love poems, medical prescriptions, and mathematical exercises all survive on papyrus from ancient Egypt, giving us a window into daily life that is unmatched for any other ancient civilization. When the supply of papyrus from Egypt was disrupted in the ancient world, the effect on record keeping and intellectual life across the Mediterranean was so significant that alternative writing materials had to be developed. Parchment made from animal skin became the primary writing material in Europe, largely because Egyptian papyrus was no longer reliably available. The writing surface that the Egyptians invented in the marshes of the Nile Delta shaped the intellectual infrastructure of the ancient world for over 3,000 years. The ancient Egyptians used a calendar of 365 days and were among the first to do so. The Egyptian calendar was one of the earliest and most sophisticated attempts in human history to organize time into a systematic and predictable framework. It was based on the agricultural and astronomical realities of life in the Nile Valley. The year was divided into 12 months of 30 days each, giving 360 days, with 5 additional days added at the end of the year as feast days for the gods: Osiris, Horus, Set, Isis, and Nephthys. The total of 365 days matched the solar year closely enough to be enormously useful for agricultural planning. The Egyptians also used the heliacal rising of the star Sirius, which they called Sopdet, as a marker for the beginning of the new year. Sirius disappeared below the horizon for a period, and then reappeared just before dawn, on or around the same day each year that coincided roughly with the beginning of the Nile flood. This gave the Egyptians a reliable astronomical signal for the most important event in their agricultural calendar. The Egyptian calendar influenced later calendars, including the Julian calendar introduced by Julius Caesar after his time in Egypt with Cleopatra, which in turn became the foundation for the Gregorian calendar most of the world uses today. The organization of our modern year carries within it the deep imprint of Egyptian minds observing a desert sky thousands of years ago. The Egyptians also had a separate lunar calendar used for religious festivals that ran alongside the civil calendar. Coordinating the two calendars, which fell in and out of alignment with each other over cycles of years, was a task that required specialist astronomical knowledge and was managed by priests with specific responsibility for timekeeping. The Egyptians tracked the movements of the stars with great attention, not for astrological prediction in the way later cultures used astronomy, but for the practical purposes of calendar management and religious scheduling. Star clocks, tables painted on the inside lids of coffins, recorded which star would be visible on the meridian at each hour of the night throughout the year, allowing observers to tell the time in darkness simply by knowing which star to look for. The night sky above the Egyptian desert was vast and clear and full of information, and the Egyptians read it with the same patient attention they gave to the rising of the Nile. The Egyptians built their cities of mud brick, but their temples and tombs in stone. This distinction was not accidental. It was deeply intentional and philosophically meaningful. Mud brick was the material of the living world, practical, available, and temporary. Stone was the material of eternity. Houses, palaces, administrative buildings, even the actual residences of pharaohs, were built of mud brick that has long since dissolved back into the earth. But the temples of the gods and the tombs of the dead were built in stone because the gods and the dead were permanent in a way that the living were not. This is why so much of what survives from ancient Egypt is religious and funerary in nature. Not because the Egyptians were obsessed with death in a morbid sense, but because they built their most important things to last. And their most important things were the houses of the gods and the homes of the dead. The palaces of the pharaohs have vanished almost without trace. The tombs of those same pharaohs still stand. Egypt invested its most durable material in the things it considered most permanent, and the things it considered most permanent were not the achievements of this life, but the structures that would survive into the next one. Mud brick construction was not primitive or inadequate. It was the appropriate material for its purpose. Mud brick buildings could be large and comfortable and well organized. The workers' village at Deir el-Medina was built of mud brick, and its remains give us a clear picture of comfortable and well-organized domestic space. Houses were whitewashed inside and out. They contained sleeping platforms, cooking areas, storage rooms, and small shrines. Larger houses had upper floors and roof terraces where families slept in hot weather. The distinction between mud, brick, and stone in ancient Egypt was not a distinction between poor and rich, or between functional and decorative. It was a distinction between the temporary and the eternal. And the Egyptians applied their most valuable material to the purposes they considered most enduring. The ancient Egyptian economy ran on grain rather than money. Ancient Egypt did not use coins or a monetary currency for most of its history. The economy was organized around the redistribution of commodities, primarily grain, but also linen, oil, copper, and other goods. The state collected taxes in the form of a percentage of agricultural production, stored those goods in enormous granaries, and redistributed them to workers, soldiers, priests, and officials in the form of wages. A worker on the royal tomb at Deir el-Medina was paid in a monthly ration of emmer wheat and barley, along with other commodities like fish, vegetables, and pottery. When those rations failed to arrive on time, the workers went on strike, one of the earliest recorded labor actions in human history. Prices for goods were expressed in units of grain or copper, allowing a form of standardized valuation without physical coinage. This grain-based economy required an enormous administrative apparatus to measure, record, transport, store, and distribute commodities across the country. The scribes who managed this system were among the most important and most numerous officials in the Egyptian state. The Nile's agricultural productivity was the foundation of everything. As long as the flood came and the grain grew, the economy could function, the workers could be paid, the temples could be maintained, and the monuments could be built. Trade was also an important part of the Egyptian economy, even though it was organized differently from modern commerce. Egypt exported grain, linen, papyrus, gold, and manufactured goods, and imported timber from Lebanon, copper from Cyprus, tin from Anatolia or Afghanistan, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and luxury goods from the land of Punt, including incense, ebony, and exotic animals. The Egyptian state managed most of this long-distance trade through official expeditions organized by the royal administration, rather than through private merchants operating independently. The famous expedition to Punt, recorded at Hatshepsut's temple at Deir el-Bahari, was organized and funded by the state, and its returns went to the state, specifically to the temple of Amun at Karnak, which Hatshepsut was refurbishing and expanding at the time. Trade was not separate from politics in ancient Egypt. It was an extension of it. Ancient Egyptian art followed strict rules that were maintained for over 3,000 years. One of the most striking things about Egyptian art to modernize is how consistent it remained across an enormous span of time. An image carved in the Old Kingdom period looks remarkably similar in style to one carved 2,000 years later in the New Kingdom. This consistency was not laziness or lack of creativity. It was a deliberate and carefully maintained tradition that served specific religious and communicative purposes. Egyptian art was not trying to reproduce what the eye actually sees. It was trying to show the essential truth of a subject, representing each part of the body from its most recognizable angle. The head was shown in profile. The eye was shown full face within the profile head. The shoulders were shown full face. The torso twisted to show the waist in profile. The legs and feet were shown in profile. The result is a figure that no human being has ever actually looked like, but that conveys every important element of the human form simultaneously. Size in Egyptian art indicated importance rather than spatial reality. The pharaoh was always the largest figure in any composition. Enemies were always smaller. Gods might be larger still. The rules of Egyptian art were a visual language as precise and conventional as the hieroglyphic writing that often accompanied the images. Color in Egyptian art also followed conventions. Men's skin was painted red-brown. Women's skin was painted yellow. Gold indicated divinity. Blue and green indicated life and fertility. Black indicated death, but also resurrection, because the dark soil of the Nile flood was the color both of death and of new growth. These conventions were not limitations. They were a vocabulary. Within them, skilled Egyptian artists produced work of extraordinary refinement and power that communicated clearly across the enormous distances of time and culture to audiences who know nothing else about the civilization that made it. The Amarna period art of Akhenaten's reign was the great exception to these rules. For those 17 years, the conventions were abandoned in favor of a naturalistic style that showed the royal family in intimate domestic scenes, playing with children, exchanging gifts, sitting in relaxed poses that would have been unimaginable in any other period of Egyptian art. After the Amarna period ended, the old conventions reasserted themselves with a completeness that makes the Amarna interlude feel like a strange dream from which Egypt woke itself firmly and then worked to forget. The ancient Egyptians played board games, wrote love poetry, and enjoyed music and feasting. It would be a mistake to think of ancient Egypt only in terms of pyramids and mummies and the solemn business of preparing for death. Egyptian life, especially for those with enough wealth and leisure to enjoy it, contained considerable pleasure and amusement. Board games were enormously popular. Senet, a game played on a grid of 30 squares, was one of the most beloved pastimes in Egypt for thousands of years. It was played by people of all social classes and was also given religious significance as a representation of the journey through the underworld. Love poetry survives from the New Kingdom period that expresses romantic feeling with a directness and tenderness that feels entirely recognizable across the distance of 3,000 years. One poem has a young man describing his beloved as a trap set by the gods from which he cannot escape and has no desire to. Another has a young woman lying awake listening to her lover's footsteps in the street outside her window. Music was central to religious ceremonies, royal entertainments, and daily life. Harps, lutes, lyres, flutes, sistrums and drums were all played, and musical performances accompanied temple rituals, royal banquets, and harvest festivals. Feasts depicted on tomb walls show guests wearing perfumed wax cones on their heads that melted slowly through the evening and released fragrance into the air. They were entertained by musicians and dancers, while servants brought them food and wine. The Egyptians who built the eternal monuments also knew how to enjoy the entirely temporary pleasures of an evening well spent. Children in ancient Egypt played with toys that would be recognizable to children today. Wooden animals with moving parts, leather balls, carved wooden dolls with hair made of clay beads. They played with spinning tops and knuckle bones. They swam in the Nile and played games in the streets. Tomb paintings show children wrestling and playing tug-of-war. The solemn religion of ancient Egypt and the playful daily life of its people existed side by side without apparent contradiction, because the Egyptians understood that the gods had created the world for human beings to live in as fully as possible, and that living fully meant not just building temples and preparing tombs, but also laughing and loving and playing board games in the evening before the lamps went out. Cleopatra was not Egyptian by ancestry, but she was the first of her dynasty to speak the Egyptian language. The Cleopatra most people know, Cleopatra VII, was actually Macedonian Greek by descent. She was a member of the Ptolemaic dynasty, founded by one of Alexander the Great's generals, after Alexander conquered Egypt in 332 years before the Common Era. For nearly 300 years, the Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt had governed the country while remaining culturally and linguistically Greek. They spoke Greek at court, wrote their official documents in Greek, and largely maintained Greek customs and traditions. Cleopatra was the remarkable exception. She learned to speak Egyptian, making her the first member of her dynasty to do so. And she also learned several other languages, including Ethiopian, Hebrew, Arabic, and Parthian. This linguistic ability allowed her to communicate directly with her subjects and with foreign ambassadors without interpreters, which gave her a significant political and diplomatic advantage. She also presented herself in the tradition of the ancient pharaohs, adopting Egyptian religious roles and being depicted in Egyptian artistic style. Her relationships with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony were not simply romantic stories. They were sophisticated political alliances aimed at preserving Egyptian independence against the expanding power of Rome. She was the last independent ruler of ancient Egypt. After her death in 30 years before the Common Era, Egypt became a Roman province, and the 3,000-year story of pharaonic civilization came to its close. The Romans who took over Egypt were fascinated and somewhat overwhelmed by what they found. Egypt was the oldest, most mysterious, and in many ways the most impressive civilization the Roman world had encountered. Roman emperors presented themselves as pharaohs in Egyptian temples, wearing Egyptian dress and performing Egyptian rituals, even as they governed the country as a Roman province. Obelisks were taken to Rome to adorn the city. Egyptian religious cults spread throughout the Roman Empire. The worship of Isis became one of the most popular mystery religions in the Roman world, attracting devotees from Britain to Mesopotamia. Egypt absorbed Rome as it had absorbed every other conqueror. It was taken politically, but it gave back its gods and its mysteries, and its ancient prestige to the civilization that thought it was doing the taking. The ancient city of Alexandria was one of the greatest centers of learning in the ancient world. Founded by Alexander the Great in 331 years before the Common Era on the Mediterranean coast of Egypt, Alexandria grew within a few generations into the largest and most cosmopolitan city in the ancient world. At its heart was the famous Library of Alexandria, which aimed to collect copies of every work of literature, philosophy, science, and scholarship that had been produced in the ancient world. At its height, the library may have held hundreds of thousands of papyrus scrolls. Scholars from across the Greek-speaking world came to Alexandria to study and work. The mathematician Euclid developed his foundational work in geometry there. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth with remarkable accuracy there. Archimedes may have studied there. The physician Herophilos performed some of the first systematic human dissections there, laying the foundations of anatomical knowledge. The library did not burn in a single catastrophic fire, as the popular story suggests. It declined gradually over centuries through a combination of funding cuts, political instability, and the slow erosion of the institutions that had supported it. But for the period of its greatest flourishing, Alexandria was the intellectual capital of the ancient world, and the fact that it was built on Egyptian soil reflects the deep continuity between the ancient Egyptian tradition of learning and the Greek culture that absorbed and extended it. Alexandria had a great lighthouse, the Pharaohs, which was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It stood on a small island in the harbour and used a system of mirrors to project a beam of light that could guide ships from enormous distances. It was destroyed by earthquakes in the medieval period, and its remains lie on the floor of Alexandria's harbour, where underwater archaeologists have been slowly mapping them. The city that Alexander built at the mouth of the Nile was in some ways the final expression of what Egypt had always been, a place where knowledge accumulated, where different traditions met and merged, where the practical and the philosophical coexisted, and where the human desire to understand the world found an environment in which it could flourish. Egypt's ancient civilization lasted for over 3,000 years, longer than almost any other in human history. When we talk about ancient Egypt as a single civilization, we are talking about a span of time almost impossible to fully comprehend. From the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under the first pharaoh, around 3,100 years before the Common Era, to the death of Cleopatra, in 30 years before the Common Era, is a period of over 3,000 years. To put that in perspective, the distance in time between Cleopatra and ourselves today is roughly 2,000 years. The distance between Cleopatra and the builders of the Great Pyramid is roughly 2,500 years. Cleopatra was closer to us in time than she was to the pyramid builders, the civilization that produced the Sphinx, the pyramids, the Valley of the Kings, the temples of Karnak and Abu Simbel, the Book of the Dead and the love poetry, and the board games, and the medical texts, and the mathematical knowledge, was not a brief flowering. It was a sustained achievement of human organization, creativity, and determination that lasted longer than almost any other continuous civilization in the historical record. Its ruins are still the largest human structures built before the industrial age. Its ideas about death and rebirth and cosmic order influenced the Greek world that conquered it, and through Greece influenced the Roman world, and through Rome the entire subsequent history of Western civilization. Egypt did not simply exist, it endured, and in enduring it, shaped the world that came after it in ways that are still being discovered and understood. Modern Egyptology began with Napoleon's expedition to Egypt in 1798, which brought not only soldiers but scientists, artists, and scholars who documented everything they could see with extraordinary thoroughness. The Description de l'Égypte, the multi-volume publication that resulted from that expedition, introduced the ancient world to modern Europe in a way nothing had done before, and sparked an obsession with Egypt that has never entirely faded. Today, Egyptologists continue to make new discoveries. New tombs are found. New papyri are deciphered. New technologies reveal hidden chambers and buried cities. The 3,000-year civilization is not fully known. It may never be fully known, but each new discovery adds another voice to the conversation that has been going on between ancient Egypt and the world that came after it. For as long as people have been standing before those great silent stones and asking what they mean, the last hieroglyphic inscription was carved in 394 of the Common Era. The writing system that the ancient Egyptians had used for over 3,000 years did not disappear overnight. It faded slowly as the culture that had given it meaning was absorbed first by Greek and then by Roman influence. By the time of the Roman Empire, the knowledge of how to read and write hieroglyphs was increasingly restricted to a small number of priests at a handful of temples. The last known hieroglyphic inscription is carved at the Temple of Philae in southern Egypt and dates to the 24th of August, 394 of the Common Era. It was carved by a priest named Esmet Akom. After that, silence. The knowledge of how to read the script that had recorded the longest continuous civilization in human history was lost for nearly 1,500 years. The language continued in a transformed form as Coptic, the script still used by the Coptic Christian community in Egypt today. But the hieroglyphic system itself became unreadable. Centuries of scholars looked at temple walls covered in images and could not decipher a single word. It took the discovery of the Rosetta Stone in 1799 and the genius of Jean-François Champollion, who cracked the code in 1822, to restore the voices of the ancient Egyptians to the world after so long a silence. The Temple of Philae, where that last inscription was carved, is itself now on an island in the middle of Lake Nasser, having been moved, like Abu Simbel, when the Aswan High Dam was built. It was dismantled block by block and rebuilt on the island of Agilkia between 1972 and 1980. Visitors can reach it by boat and walk among its columns past the reliefs of gods and pharaohs that were carved there in the centuries when the old religion was making its final stand against the rising tide of Christianity. The last hieroglyph, carved by Esmet Akom, is still there. A small inscription by a man whose name we know who belonged to the last generation of people in the world who could read the writing on those walls. He carved it, and then the knowledge was gone, and the walls stood silent for 1,500 years until a young French linguist held up the Rosetta Stone and gave the ancient Egyptians back their voice. And so we come gently to the end of our long journey through the world of ancient Egypt. We have walked the banks of the Nile in flood and stood in the shadow of pyramids that were old when Rome was young. We have looked into the golden face of a dead boy king and heard the scribes scratching their brushes across papyrus in the lamplight. We have seen the priests at dawn caring for a god who lived in stone, and the workers at dusk returning to their village from the pyramid site with aching backs and full stomachs. We have understood that Egypt was never simply a world of death and mystery and golden monuments. It was a world of people who loved their cats and played their board games and wrote letters to their families and worried about the harvest and looked up at the stars and tried to make sense of what they saw. They built in stone because they wanted something to survive them. And it has, against all the odds and across all the centuries it has. Only fragments remain in many places now. A painted wall in a tomb shaft, a cartouche carved into a temple column, a papyrus fragment in a museum case, a mummy in a darkened room. But even those fragments still speak. They carry the breath of a world that organized itself around the idea that nothing truly ends, that life flows into death and death flows back into life, the way the Nile itself rises and falls and rises again. The pyramids are still standing in the desert where they were built more than 4,000 years ago. The stars that the ancient Egyptians watched so carefully are still moving through the sky above the Giza Plateau. The Nile is still flowing north toward the sea, as it has flowed for millions of years before any human eye watched it. And the names carved into the stone, Khufu and Hatshepsut and Rameses and Nefertiti, and the thousand smaller names of scribes and workers and priests that archaeology keeps recovering from the sand, are still there to be read by anyone who knows how. If this quiet journey through the ancient world brought you some peace tonight, I would love it if you liked or subscribed or simply left a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. And if there is still some wakefulness left in you, there should be another calm history waiting on the screen for you now. But for this moment, there is nothing more to follow. Let the desert wind move through the columns of Karnak. Let the Nile find its way to the sea in the dark. Let your breathing become slow and even and easy. The stars above the pyramid are the same stars that shone on the people who built it. They are still there. You are still here. And for now, that is enough. Sleep well. Good night. The ancient Egyptians were skilled astronomers who mapped the night sky with remarkable precision. The Egyptian understanding of astronomy was not the abstract intellectual pursuit that it became in later Greek and Islamic civilizations. It was intensely practical and deeply religious. The stars were understood as divine beings, the souls of the dead, the bodies of gods making their eternal journeys across the sky. The northern stars that never set, which we call circumpolar stars, were called the imperishable ones by the Egyptians because they never disappeared below the horizon. They were associated with the souls of the blessed dead who had achieved eternal life and who moved ceaselessly through the sky as the Pharaoh moved through eternity. The pyramids were oriented with extraordinary precision toward the cardinal directions, and the shafts cut through the body of the Great Pyramid have been shown to align with specific stars that were significant in Egyptian religion. One shaft in the king's chamber pointed toward the star Thuban, which was the pole star at the time of the pyramid's construction. Another pointed toward Orion's belt, which the Egyptians associated with Osiris. A shaft in the queen's chamber pointed toward Sirius, associated with the goddess Isis. Whether these alignments were deliberate or coincidental has been debated by scholars. The precision of Egyptian astronomical observation suggests they were deliberate. The Egyptians also tracked the movements of the 5 planets visible to the naked eye, which they called stars that know no rest, distinguishing them from the fixed stars by their wandering motion across the sky. They identified constellations and gave them names and stories, though their constellation system was different from the one the Greeks later developed, and that we use today. The decan system, in which the year was divided into 36 periods, each marked by the rising of a specific star group, was an Egyptian invention that passed into Greek astronomy and eventually became part of the astrological tradition of the Western world. Egyptian astronomical knowledge was practical, religious, and precise, and it shaped the intellectual traditions of the civilizations that came after it in ways that are still visible in the sky charts we use today. The ancient Egyptians had a complex understanding of the human soul that consisted of multiple parts. The Egyptian concept of the self after death was far more complex than the simple idea of a soul leaving a body that is familiar from later religious traditions. The Egyptians believed that a human being consisted of several distinct elements that had different fates after death and different requirements for survival. The Ka was the life force, or vital essence of a person, created at birth and surviving after death. It needed to be sustained by food offerings left at the tomb and was the part of the self that the mummy was intended to house. The BA was something closer to the personality or individual character of a person, often depicted as a human-headed bird that could fly between the tomb and the world above. The BA needed to be able to recognize its mummy and return to it each night. This is one reason why preserving the appearance of the face was so important in mummification. The Ak was the transfigured spirit of a person who had successfully navigated the underworld and achieved eternal life. It was the part of the self that became permanently divine after death. The shadow was also considered part of the self and needed protection. The name was considered so essential to identity that destroying a person's name was understood as a form of killing. This is why erasing names from monuments was such a powerful act of condemnation. The heart was the seat of intelligence and conscience, and the part of the self that was weighed against the feather of mud. All of these elements together made up a complete person in Egyptian understanding. Death did not simplify this complexity. It made it more demanding, requiring each element to be properly cared for, and each relationship between them to be maintained if the deceased was to achieve the eternal existence they had worked so hard to prepare for. The ancient Egyptians built a network of trade routes that connected them to the wider world. Egypt was not an isolated civilization turned inward toward the Nile. It was connected to the wider world through an extensive network of trade relationships that brought goods from as far away as Afghanistan and sub-Saharan Africa to the workshops and temples of the Nile Valley. The land of Punt, reached by sea expeditions down the Red Sea, provided incense, myrrh, ebony, exotic animals, and gold. Lebanon provided the cedars of Lebanon, tall, straight timber that Egypt's own forests could not supply, and that was essential for the construction of large boats, coffins, and temple furniture. The mines of Sinai provided turquoise and copper. The eastern desert contained gold deposits that made Egypt one of the wealthiest states in the ancient world by any measure. Nubia to the south provided gold, ebony, ivory, cattle, and enslaved people taken in military campaigns and raids. The relationship between Egypt and Nubia was long, complex, and not always unequal. During the 25th dynasty, it was Nubian kings from the kingdom of Kush who ruled Egypt, presenting themselves as true pharaohs and building pyramids of their own that can still be seen in modern Sudan. The trade networks that Egypt maintained required diplomatic skill, military power, navigational knowledge, and administrative capacity that went far beyond the management of the Nile Valley alone. Egypt was a great power in a world of great powers, and it engaged with that world through gifts, marriages, letters, military expeditions, and commercial relationships that linked the Nile to the Euphrates and the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. Egyptian architecture used techniques that modern engineers still find impressive. The engineering knowledge that the ancient Egyptians brought to their building projects was accumulated across centuries of practical experience and passed down through generations of master builders. They understood how to create stable foundations in sandy desert soil. They understood how to transport and lift enormous weights using levers, sleds, ramps, and the organized labor of large numbers of workers. They understood how to cut stone with copper tools in a way that achieved a precision that is still difficult to replicate by hand today. The fit between the casing stones of the Great Pyramid, before those stones were removed, was so tight that a piece of paper cannot be inserted between them. The granite blocks in the king's chamber were cut and fitted with comparable precision, despite the enormous weight and hardness of the material. Egyptian architects understood the distribution of weight in large structures and used corbelled vaulting and relieving chambers above important rooms to prevent the enormous mass of stone above from crushing the spaces below. The relieving chambers above the king's chamber in the Great Pyramid are a particularly elegant solution to this problem, consisting of 5 chambers stacked above the ceiling of the main room that distribute the weight of the pyramid above them, away from the flat ceiling below. Egyptian builders worked in a world without modern mathematics, without steel tools, without engines, without measuring instruments beyond a plumb bob, a set square, and a knotted rope. The fact that they built structures of such scale and such precision with those simple tools and organized human labor is one of the most remarkable things about ancient Egypt, and one that continues to generate genuine wonder among the engineers and architects who study them. The Nile Delta was one of the most agriculturally productive regions in the ancient world. The Nile does not simply flow in a single channel to the sea. In its final stretch before reaching the Mediterranean, it fans out into a wide triangle of channels, marshes, and fertile land that the Greeks called the Delta because its shape resembled their letter of that name. The Delta was the most fertile and most densely populated region of Egypt, a vast expanse of dark silt soil watered by multiple river channels and protected from the sea by a fringe of marshland and papyrus swamps. It produced enormous quantities of grain, vegetables, flax, and papyrus, and supported a population far larger than the narrow river valley to the south could hold. The Delta was also more open to outside contact and influence than Upper Egypt. Its coastline faced the Mediterranean, and its eastern edge bordered the Sinai, making it the gateway through which traders, diplomats, and invaders entered Egypt from the north and east. Several periods of Egyptian history saw foreign rulers establish themselves in the Delta, while Egyptian rulers continued to control the south. The Hyksos, a people of Near Eastern origin, ruled the Delta and much of Lower Egypt for over a century before being driven out by the Theban rulers who founded the new kingdom. The experience of Hyksos rule left its mark on Egypt. The Egyptians adopted new technologies from the Hyksos, including the horse-drawn chariot, new types of weapons, and new musical instruments. Foreign contact and even foreign domination did not weaken Egyptian civilization. It absorbed what was useful and continued. Egyptian festivals brought the gods out of the temples and into the streets. The great religious festivals of ancient Egypt were not solemn private affairs, conducted behind temple walls by priests in restricted sanctuaries. They were public celebrations that brought entire cities into the streets and allowed ordinary people to come closer to the divine than the restrictions of daily temple worship normally permitted. During major festivals, the statue of the god was removed from its inner sanctuary, placed in a model boat called a bark shrine, and carried on the shoulders of priests in a great procession through the streets or along the river. The Opet festival at Thebes was the most important celebration of the year, lasting for several weeks during the flood season, when the agricultural calendar allowed a pause in fieldwork. The bark of Amun was carried in procession from Karnak to the temple of Luxor and back, accompanied by musicians, dancers, acrobats, and vast crowds who lined the processional avenue to watch and celebrate. Oracle festivals allowed ordinary people to bring their disputes and questions to the divine presence carried in the processional bark. A petitioner would ask a question, and the priests carrying the bark would move forward or backward to indicate a yes or no answer. This gave ordinary Egyptians a form of access to divine judgment that the daily temple rituals completely denied them. Festivals were also occasions for the distribution of food and beer from the temple stores to the people gathered to celebrate. The gods who were being honored were also, in a very practical sense, feeding their worshippers through the redistributive mechanism of the temple economy. The festival calendar shaped the rhythm of Egyptian life in ways that went far beyond the religious. It organized social time, provided occasions for community gathering, offered economic redistribution, and gave ordinary people their most direct experience of the divine power that the pharaoh and the priests mediated on their behalf every other day of the year. The ancient Egyptians left behind literature that still speaks with extraordinary vividness. Beyond the religious texts and administrative documents, ancient Egypt produced a rich tradition of literary writing that reveals the inner life of the civilization with surprising intimacy. The tale of Sinuhe, written in the Middle Kingdom period around 2,000 years before the Common Era, tells the story of a court official who flees Egypt after the death of his pharaoh, lives in exile among foreign peoples, achieves wealth and success abroad, and eventually returns home to die in Egypt and be buried in the proper Egyptian way. It is a story about identity and belonging, and the pull of home that reads with a narrative sophistication that would not embarrass a modern novelist. The shipwrecked sailor tells the story of a man washed up on a magical island inhabited by a great serpent who tells him his own story of loss and survival. It uses the frame narrative structure, a story within a story, with a confidence that suggests a rich literary tradition behind it. Wisdom literature survives in texts called instructions, addressed by a father to a son or a king to his successor, offering advice about how to live well and act justly and succeed in the world. Some of this advice would fit comfortably in a modern self-help book. Other parts reflect the very specific social hierarchies of ancient Egypt. All of it reveals a culture that thought carefully about how to live and valued the ability to articulate those thoughts in language precisely chosen and beautifully arranged. The love poetry of the New Kingdom period is perhaps the most immediately accessible of all ancient Egyptian literature to a modern reader. It uses the voices of young men and women in the first person, addressing their beloved or describing their feelings with a directness that crosses 3,000 years without losing any of its warmth. To read it is to hear a human voice speaking from the ancient world about something that has not changed at all. And so we come gently to the end of our long journey through the world of ancient Egypt. We have walked the banks of the Nile in flood and stood in the shadow of pyramids that were old when Rome was young. We have looked into the golden face of a dead boy king and heard the scribes scratching their brushes across papyrus in the lamplight. We have seen the priests at dawn caring for a god who lived in stone, and the workers at dusk returning to their village from the pyramid site with aching backs and full stomachs. We have understood that Egypt was never simply a world of death and mystery and golden monuments. It was a world of people who loved their cats and played their board games and wrote letters to their families and worried about the harvest and looked up at the stars and tried to make sense of what they saw. They built in stone because they wanted something to survive them. And it has, against all the odds and across all the centuries it has. Only fragments remain in many places now. A painted wall in a tomb shaft, a cartouche carved into a temple column, a papyrus fragment in a museum case, a mummy in a darkened room. But even those fragments still speak. They carry the breath of a world that organized itself around the idea that nothing truly ends, that life flows into death, and death flows back into life, the way the Nile itself rises and falls and rises again. The pyramids are still standing in the desert where they were built more than 4,000 years ago. The stars that the ancient Egyptians watched so carefully are still moving through the sky above the Giza plateau. The Nile is still flowing north toward the sea, as it has flowed for millions of years before any human eye watched it. And the names carved into the stone, Khufu and Hatshepsut, and Rameses, and Nefertiti, and the 1,000 smaller names of scribes and workers, and priests that archaeology keeps recovering from the sand, are still there to be read by anyone who knows how. If this quiet journey through the ancient world brought you some peace tonight, I would love it if you liked or subscribed, or simply left a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. And if there is still some wakefulness left in you, there should be another calm history waiting on the screen for you now. But for this moment, there is nothing more to follow. Let the desert wind move through the columns of Karnak. Let the Nile find its way to the sea in the dark. Let your breathing become slow and even and easy. The stars above the pyramid are the same stars that shone on the people who built it. They are still there. You are still here. And for now, that is enough. Sleep well. Good night. The ancient Egyptians developed sophisticated mathematical knowledge to build and administer their civilization. Egyptian mathematics was not abstract in the way that Greek mathematics would later become. It was intensely practical, developed in response to the real problems of measuring land, calculating grain volumes, organizing labor, and designing buildings. After every Nile flood, the boundaries of fields were washed away and had to be re-established by surveyors called rope stretchers, who used knotted cords to measure and mark out the agricultural land. This practical need drove the development of geometry. The Rind mathematical papyrus, now in the British Museum, dates to around 1650 years before the Common Era and contains 84 mathematical problems with their solutions. It covers multiplication, division, fractions, geometry, and the calculation of areas and volumes. The Egyptians could calculate the area of a circle using a method that gives a value for pi of approximately 3.16, remarkably close to the true value. They could calculate the volume of a truncated pyramid, a problem of considerable mathematical sophistication. They used a base 10 number system like ours, but wrote it additively rather than positionally, meaning they repeated symbols rather than using place values. Egyptian mathematics was not as abstract or as general as Greek mathematics would become, but it was more than adequate for the practical demands of one of the most organizationally complex civilizations in the ancient world. The administrative mathematics required to organize the construction of the Great Pyramid, to calculate the rations for tens of thousands of workers, to plan the logistics of quarrying, transporting, and placing millions of stone blocks, was a genuine intellectual achievement, even if it was never written down as a general theory. Egyptian religion involved hundreds of gods who could combine and transform in complex ways. The religion of ancient Egypt was not a simple pantheon of fixed deities, each with their own specific domain and unvarying character. It was an extraordinarily fluid and complex system in which gods could merge with each other, transform into each other, take on new aspects, and be understood simultaneously at multiple levels of meaning. Ra and Amun merged to become Amun-Ra, king of the gods. Ra and Osiris merged in the deepest hour of the night, when the solar bark passed through the underworld, in a union that allowed the sun to be reborn at dawn. Horus could be the distant celestial falcon, the son of Osiris, or the child Harpocrates sitting on his mother's lap, depending on which aspect the worshipper was addressing. Local gods from different parts of Egypt were identified with national gods and continued to be worshipped under their own names, while also being understood as expressions of the larger divine being. This flexibility allowed Egyptian religion to absorb local traditions and accommodate theological development without requiring the rejection of what had come before. New ideas could be added without old ones being abandoned. This is one reason why Egyptian religion accumulated such extraordinary complexity over time. Nothing was ever simply discarded. Everything was incorporated, layered over what had come before, creating a theological palimpsest of extraordinary richness and depth. The multiplicity of Egyptian gods was not a sign of confusion or inconsistency. It was a way of acknowledging that the divine reality was too vast and too complex to be captured by any single image or any single name. Every god was a facet of a larger truth, and the multitude of deities was the Egyptian way of honoring the inexhaustible complexity of the sacred. The ancient Egyptians understood grief and expressed it with remarkable honesty. Egyptian funerary texts and tomb inscriptions can give the impression that the Egyptians approached death with complete equanimity and confident preparation. But personal documents tell a different story. Letters written to the dead, placed in tombs in the hope that the deceased could read them, reveal people struggling with ordinary human grief in ways that feel entirely recognizable. One letter from a widower to his dead wife complains that she has allowed illness to come into his house, even from beyond the grave, and asks her to intercede with the gods on behalf of their family. The tone is simultaneously tender and aggrieved. The voice of a man who misses his wife and is angry about it. Tomb autobiographies, inscriptions carved by the tomb owners about their own lives, emphasize their good deeds, their generosity to the poor, their fairness in dealing with their workers, and their care for their families. They are not boasts. They are arguments addressed to the divine judges of the dead, asking to be remembered well and judged mercifully. Behind the formal religious architecture of Egyptian belief were ordinary human beings who loved their families and feared death, and hoped that the careful preparations they had made would be enough. The universality of those feelings is what makes ancient Egypt feel so present, even across such an enormous distance of time. The monuments are extraordinary. The religion is complex and fascinating. The history is long and eventful, and still incompletely understood. But beneath all of it are people, hoping to be remembered, hoping to be judged kindly, hoping that what they had built and what they had loved would somehow survive the darkness and emerge into light again on the other side.